She was just a child, 12 years old, full of life, laughter, and innocence. But on that night, all of it was stolen in an instant, not by chance, not by accident, but by a decision. A decision made in a room filled with professionals sworn to protect and heal. When her small body began to fail, when every second mattered, help did not come. Not because the hospital lacked resources, not because the doctors didn't know what to do, but because of something far more sinister, something that has claimed countless lives long before hers. It was the pause, the hesitation, the unspoken judgment of her skin. They watched, they waited, while her breath grew shallow, while her mother's cries filled the air. And by the time they moved, the damage was already done. What unfolded next would not only change this family forever, but would ignite a fire that could not be silenced. How could those who swore an oath turn away from a child fighting to survive? And how many more will suffer before enough is finally enough? This is more than a story, it's a question you cannot ignore. Stay with me, and as you listen, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if it were your child? If you believe these stories matter, if you believe silence must end, then like, comment, and subscribe, because together we carry the responsibility of change. Camille was no ordinary mother. She was strong, successful, and deeply protective of her son Jordan, a boy who had always carried a spark that drew people to him. At 12, Jordan was curious and ambitious, always asking questions, always trying to understand the world around him. He loved playing basketball after school, his laughter echoing across the neighborhood park, his energy boundless. To his friends, he was simply Jordan, the boy who loved sneakers, comic books, and had an infectious smile. To Camille, he was everything. She had worked tirelessly for years, climbing her way up in a world that often doubted her, until she became a respected CEO. It wasn't just about success. It was about showing her son that nothing could stop him from achieving greatness. Their life, though demanding, was full of love and promise. Camille's mornings were often a whirlwind, conference calls, quick breakfasts, and Jordan packing his backpack while chattering about his day ahead. Evenings were their time. Dinner at the table, homework discussions, and sometimes a movie before bed. In those quiet hours, life felt normal, safe, ordinary. But beneath that normalcy was a reality Camille could never ignore. She knew the world didn't see her son the way she did. To her, he was brilliant, kind, and full of potential. To others, he was a statistic, a stereotype, a face they would judge before knowing his story. Still, Camille believed love and preparation could protect him. She taught him to be cautious, respectful, and aware. Yet, nothing could prepare her for the night that would shatter the fragile sense of security she had built. It began like any other evening. Homework done, dinner cleared, Jordan suddenly not feeling well. She brushed his forehead, too warm, his breath slightly labored. A mother's instinct told her it was serious. Within minutes, what seemed like a fever spiraled into something far worse. Panic rising, she rushed him to the ER, her heart pounding with every beat. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking into a storm that would test everything she believed about safety, justice, and the value of her son's life. The emergency room was cold, sterile, and too quiet for what was unfolding in Camille's chest. Jordan slumped against her, his breath shallow, his face pale and damp with sweat. Camille's voice shook as she pleaded at the front desk, urgency breaking through every syllable. But instead of immediate concern, she was met with indifference. The receptionist's eyes flicked up, scanning Camille and her son, before settling back on the computer screen. "Fill out these forms," she said, her tone flat, as if Jordan weren't fighting for his life beside her. Camille's hands trembled as she scribbled on the paper, each second dragging like an eternity. Behind her, the waiting room buzzed with idle chatter, a stark contrast to the storm of fear consuming her. She looked back at her son, his chest heaving, his eyes barely open, and something inside her screamed. She rushed to the nurse's station, her voice sharper now, desperate. But once again, hesitation, a glance exchanged between staff, a pause that cut deeper than any words. It wasn't lack of knowledge. It wasn't lack of beds. It was the hesitation of deciding whether her son's life deserved urgency. Minutes bled into more minutes, Jordan's condition worsening as Camille's panic mounted. She felt the weight of invisibility pressing down on them, as though her pleas were muted by the color of their skin. Other patients were called. A child with a scraped knee was ushered in. A man with a twisted ankle was seen. But Jordan, gasping for air, was still waiting. Camille's heart pounded with fury and fear. Every mother's nightmare played before her eyes, but this wasn't fate. This was choice. The choice of a system that looked at her son and saw something less. And just as Jordan's small body began to tremble, just as Camille thought she would lose him right there in the waiting room, the staff finally moved. Too late for innocence, too late for trust. And Camille knew, even as they rushed him onto a stretcher, that this night would not just pass. This night would demand justice. The chaos inside the hospital room was overwhelming. Machines beeping, nurses rushing, doctors issuing clipped commands. Jordan's small body lay on the bed, fragile against the blur of movement, his breaths shallow and uneven. Camille stood pressed against the wall, her heart slamming in her chest as she watched strangers fight to undo the damage of their delay. Fear clawed at her throat, threatening to choke her, but anger burned hotter. She couldn't shake the image of the waiting room. The receptionist's cold stare, the nurse's hesitation, the endless minutes ticking away while her son's life slipped through their fingers. The doctor barked orders, finally focused, finally treating Jordan with the urgency he should have received an hour ago. Oxygen was strapped to his face, IVs inserted, monitors tracking every fragile beat of his heart. Camille's fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She had built a life of resilience, fought for every ounce of respect she commanded in boardrooms, only to watch it all stripped away in a place where nothing mattered more than the color of her child's skin. And then the monitor flatlined for a breathless moment. Camille's body froze, her soul shattering, the world tilting into silence. Nurses scrambled, doctors shouted, machines jolted back to life, and Jordan's heart found its rhythm again. Relief crashed into her like a wave, but it came tangled with rage. Because that moment, that near death, was not inevitable. It was not random. It was the result of a pause, a decision, a judgment that her son could wait. Camille's tears blurred her vision, her voice breaking into a silent vow, never again. No mother should feel this. No child should endure this. And as Jordan's fragile breaths steadied, she knew that this was not the end of the fight. This was the beginning. Hours later, Jordan lay resting in a quiet hospital room, his small frame surrounded by the steady rhythm of machines that now kept him safe. His chest rose and fell more evenly, though the exhaustion on his young face was unbearable to witness. Camille sat by his side, her hand clutching his, refusing to let go, her mind replaying every excruciating second that had brought them here. Relief washed over her that her son was alive, but beneath it surged a tidal wave of anger. Because this wasn't simply an accident. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The receptionist's cold glance, the hesitation of the nurse, the minutes lost while Jordan's life ticked away. It wasn't incompetence. It was indifference. An indifference rooted in something deeper, uglier, and far more dangerous. Camille knew in her bones that if her son had looked different, if she herself had carried a different skin tone or a different name, he would have been rushed through those doors without question. And so, the relief of survival carried no comfort. What comfort is there in knowing your child almost died, because the world decided his life was worth less? The next morning, Camille walked into that same hospital, not as the desperate mother from the night before, but as the woman who had built a life of resilience, discipline, and undeniable success. She wasn't just Jordan's mother. She was a leader, a CEO, a woman whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of that building. And this time she wasn't asking. She was demanding accountability. The staff who had delayed Jordan's care were called into question, their silence replaced with stammering excuses. But Camille wasn't there for apologies. Apologies couldn't undo the trauma her son now carried, the terror etched into his memory of nearly fading away while people stood by. No, she was there for change. And when change did not come willingly, she brought the weight of her authority to bear. Decisions were made. Staff were dismissed. Policies were rewritten. And for once, the walls that had stood so tall around systemic neglect cracked, even if just a little. But here's the truth. What happened to Jordan isn't an isolated story. His survival is the exception, not the rule. Too many families have faced that same indifference. Too many names have been lost in the silence of emergency rooms, courtrooms, classrooms, and streets. Jordan made it home. Others did not. Camille knew that firing staff or rewriting rules in one hospital wasn't enough. This wasn't just about Jordan anymore. This was about every child who deserved to walk into a hospital and be seen as human first, not judged by the color of their skin. It was about every parent who shouldn't have to wonder if bias will stand between their child and a chance at life. And so, the incident became more than a nightmare. It became a movement. Camille began speaking out, sharing Jordan's story, not to relive the pain, but to ensure it carried weight. She spoke to audiences who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, forced to face a reality many tried to ignore. She saw other parents nodding through tears, knowing all too well the truth of her words. Because racism doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind a desk. Sometimes it wears scrubs. Sometimes it whispers in the form of a pause, a hesitation long enough to decide who is worth saving and who can wait. Jordan's survival became proof of something larger, that silence and complacency are killers in their own right. And Camille's refusal to remain silent became a reminder that change does not come without confrontation. So now, the question is not what happened to Jordan, it is what happens next. How many more children must endure this silent violence before we, as a society, say enough? How many more lives must hang in the balance before people recognize that equality isn't just a word, it's a responsibility? He lived that night. But will the next? Viewers, it's not enough to watch. It's not enough to feel outrage for a few minutes and then move on. Change begins when stories like Jordan's don't just live online, but in conversations, in actions, in choices. If this story moved you, share it. If it angered you, talk about it. And if you believe in a world where every child deserves the same chance at life, then stand up, because silence helps no one. How many more times must